Welcome back to American Arms Channel, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for sharing an absolutely gorgeous evening here on the Platte River in central Nebraska. Please excuse the beasts around me that cry because apparently I have not thrown the log and sticks enough for them. And because waterfowl season is over, we didn't have the greatest one. They are just going to make life very interesting and complain because they need to fetch. Because that's what our Labradors are for. Today, as you might have discerned from the title of the video, I want to talk about the status of the 10 gauge. Specifically, is the 10 gauge dead? The 10 gauge is the king of waterfowling shotguns. I mean, there is no mistake to be made about that. Because of the laws here in North America, and particularly the United States, it prevents us from using any bore size greater than 10 gauge. And because of that restriction, the 10 gauge Magnum holds the greatest level of payload capacity of any of the shotguns when it comes to non-toxic shot. Doesn't matter what material, it's simply volume. But in the last several years, we've seen a couple of changes in the market and in waterfowling that some have seen as the death knell for the king of waterfowling shotguns. Particularly, that is heavier than steel, or properly termed denser than steel shot materials becoming not only commercially viable and affordable, but prevalent. Things like heavy shot in 12 and 13 gram per cubic centimeter, TSS 15 and 18, as well as bismuth, plated or plain, non-plated, have been, again, prolific throughout the market, and they've been at price points that are generally affordable. And there has been a trend to go to sub-gauges, as they're known, particularly 20 and 28 gauge, as well as some 410 use. But primarily we've seen a lot of 20s followed by 28s. I am a 28 gauge aficionado and fanatic, and I love the cartridge. But the 28 and the 20 are still limited by payload capacity, regardless of whether they have a 2 3/4 or 3-inch chambering. It's simply volume of the cartridge case. So what does that mean? In 2025, there are no active manufacturers of production 10 gauge shotguns. In 2023 or 24, was it? I believe 23, Browning announced that they were officially discontinuing both the BPS 10 and the Gold 10 shotgun lines, which was kind of sad to hear, but in all fairness, at least the Gold 10 has a lot of fleas that they have not solved since 1993. It's an aged design, and they don't seem to care to really fix its problems. On top of that, they seem to not want to help the 10 gauge market. And although it constitutes less than 1% of the overall wing shooting market for ammunition and firearm sales, it's very strong, it's prevalent. And if somebody's servicing it, it'll continue. If you're listening along, you're probably saying, well, everything you say sounds great, but it's pointing to the gauge is dead. How can you say that the 10 gauge is not dead if that's the case that you're building? And in truthfulness, it doesn't look great. But what I can tell you is every single time a 10 gauge is sitting out there on the market, whether it's Gunbroker or it's your local gun store, it doesn't usually sit for long. Some of the older, more eclectic things like double barrel shotguns will sit. And because demand has increased and because it's reaching a point where most people are not really going to pay much unless they can get a great deal, you're going to see some shotguns sit. But things like the Mag 10 always tend to move at a fair price point. Standard models between $800 and $1,200 are seeming to move off of used shelves pretty dang quickly. Gunbroker and other auction sites are not a good measure point of where the market's really at, because there is always somebody with a credit card who's willing to pay whatever it takes to get it in their hands. Yes, that's free market, but it's kind of dumb in some ways. So really what I want to say here is, the 10 gauge is in demand and shot shells are readily available. But what gives this life? What makes a Gold 10, a Mag 10, a BPS 10, a classic 10 double or an SP10 or an H&R single shot or a Marlin Super Goose viable in 2025 and beyond? Well, without new manufacture, they will die a slow death. But they've been dying a slow death for ages. And the same thing could be said about 16 gauge. And just when you think, it's going to slow down, a manufacturer breathes new life into it. So there's nothing to be unexpected about that with the 10 gauge. In fact, in 2017, Browning discontinued both 10 gauge models, only to bring them back with a slight facelift and furniture change for the 2020 season. And people gobbled them up. Every single one that hit the market sold. And although people would argue against there's no point in 10 gauge with bismuth, I've proven on this channel multiple times that bismuth does nothing but increase the performance potential of the 10 gauge and makes it more relevant than ever, especially for those of us who can't count on over the decoy shots at 25 yards throughout the season. It is a dedicated big bird hunting shotgun. One of my favorite loads is 2 ounces of Boss bismuth in my Devastator hand load at 1250 feet per second or thereabouts. And I use that from mid and late season, being November, December timeframe, all the way through the last days of the season to take big greenheads and heavy honkers. I even have a BB bismuth load that I cast, tumble, and chill, or cast, chill, and tumble, the proper order, myself. And it is absolutely devastating on birds when you put them in the pattern and it's choked appropriately. Hence the name, the American Arms Devastator. But I'm beating around the bush. Why are you here listening to me talk about the 10 gauge? Why is this relevant? Answer the question, Drake. Well, the reason the 10 gauge is not going to die is because of market trends that are occurring right now, and market forces, better put. As of right now, TSS and bismuth is increasing in price significantly. I just checked prices on Rotometals as well as other sites to see where current production, American-made and foreign production bismuth is sitting, and it's coming in at $25 to $35 or more a pound, which means even for the petite 28 gauge, a 7/8 ounce or a 1 ounce charge, you're only dividing that cost per pound by about 16. So a 10-pound bag is going to run you over $300. What does that mean for loaded ammunition from manufacturers? Well, that means that you're going to end up at around $2.50 a shot, which starts to sound a lot more like TSS, but we're not shooting TSS yet. And tungsten super shot is super shot. It's amazing. But if you can't afford to use it, what's the point? So we're stuck in a condition where you can either go with steel, which has its limitations, or you can go with very expensive bismuth and tungsten. For most guys, it's not going to be an option. And that's where things like the 10 bore come back into play. With current wad technology, available powders, and somewhat available hulls, if you haven't been saving your hulls, which you should, you can end up with 1.5, 1 5/8, 1 3/4, or even more. And we'll touch upon that at a later time. But that boosts your pattern density. So although I have a less dense shot, I can go with a bigger pellet, a minimum of what I would say is a number 3 in general. Number 2s are a good standby for general waterfowl use and steel shot. And you're going to have the pattern density that you need. You're going to have the pellet size that you need to effectively dispatch birds from over the decoys to 50 yards. But pattern density is just as much of the equation as the size of the pellet and the pellet's density. Balancing these factors means a lot. If you're new to wing shooting or you're not really all that familiar with shotgun technology, it's imperative to know that pattern density and pellet type and size is what wins the day. It is what dispatches your bird. Jimmy Mueller has a theory on using smaller shot sizes in high payloads at moderate velocities. Why does that work? Because if you have the pattern density to capture the bird at the ranges that that pellet size, let's say a number 4, is capable of. So if I put 1.5 ounces of number 4s in a 10 gauge, it's actually not that heavy of a load, It's a lot of pellets. When you start cresting over that 185, 190 pellet mark, that 200 pellet mark, your pattern density starts being so great and so efficient that it pretty much ensures that you're going to strike vitals on a bird. For cross-reference, I'd like to note that Tom Roster has had a guiding table out there in generality for minimum pellet counts to ensure clean dispatch on birds. And in general, and I'm paraphrasing, you're going to have to look it up yourself, and I'll go over this in detail some other time. But it requires that around 80 to 90 pellets be used for geese, and around 100 to 110 be used for ducks. Very much generalizing there. My anecdotal experience and evidence has given me the understanding that you need a minimum of 100 to reliably strike vitals, especially at a little bit of extended range for geese, and 125 for ducks. So that's kind of where Jimmy Mueller's theory is coming from, isn't it? Now, moderate velocity. Well, why do I want a 1,200 to 1,300 foot per second steel load? Well, the short answer is the ballistics of a sphere dictate that the larger the diameter of the sphere, the more inefficient it is at going down range, because the harder you push it, the exponential increase in drag. Now, the harder you push the sphere, the exponential increase in drag. You see where the lack of benefit comes. Because in reality, if you launch a pellet at 1,200 to 1,300 feet per second, and you launch the same exact pellet at 1,500 to 1,600 feet per second, that pellet will not have any greater penetration or terminal energy at 40 yards than the slower pellet. When it really comes down to it, there is no benefit to launching pellets faster and faster. You have to crest over the 1,800, 1,900 foot per second mark to see enough of a difference at 45, 50 yards to make a difference. Now, if you're shooting birds at 25 to 35 and you just want to run the hottest payload you possibly can regarding velocity, and the patterns are there, by all means, do as you see fit. But the ballistics of a sphere dictate you're not gaining much past that. And even at 25 and 30 yards, it doesn't do a heck of a lot for you. The geese crossing the river right now could probably attest to that if it were in season. Although that's even a stretch for this range. And we've got some teal and wood ducks flying over. They're wood ducks. They're flying over right now as the sun is setting here. And with that, I should be wrapping up. But what I want to allude to, and maybe not allude to, but directly address, is that the 10 gauge is not dead. Browning killed it in 2017 and brought it back in 2020. They had a lap in production sometime in the late aughts and early 10s. So can we really trust that they won't bring it back? Can we really trust and guarantee that with the drastic increase in steel shot alternatives in 2025 and the foreseeable future that we are not going to see a resurgence in 10 gauge steel loads? I have on good authority to know that there are a number of individuals within the shotgun and firearms manufacturing sphere that are working on this problem right now. And I can tell you that in not too long of time, there is most likely going to be alternative 10 gauge steel loads that are going to really balance high payload and moderate velocities for high effectiveness. I have been playing with 1 5/8 and 1 3/4, and I have found that with market available powders, we can achieve that 1,300 foot per second mark and see devastating effects at 45 and 50 yards. And that's using airgun steel. That's B+, .177 caliber, zinc plated daisy pellets that you can buy at your local hardware store. And they perform exceptionally. So, is the 10 gauge dead? I don't think so. And if the king is dead, long live the king. But at the end of the day, it really comes down to what you want to use the field. And if you are a 10 gauge aficionado, if you really love using a big gun, even when you don't need it, but there's that assurance that I've got everything I need just in case, well, fear not, because there is a good future ahead for it. I think we are going to see a lot of market options in the near future and modestly distant future, addressing the lack of denser than steel shot, not from a availability standpoint, but from a price standpoint. And that's going to help the American waterfowler even more. Because once that technology is developed, it'll go right into alternatives and lead shot, and it should lead to greater advancements in shot shell technology. Just remember, we are dealing with, at its base, something that's 150 years old when it comes to cartridge tack. We're still dealing with a cased rim. We're still dealing with low pressures. If we can address all of the limitations of shotgunning, and we do it with something like the 10 gauge, and even the 12 gauge, and begrudgingly the 12 gauge Super Magnum, what do you think we're going to be able to accomplish with the sub gauges when we apply the same technology? It's going to be great across the board. But just like the 16 gauge isn't dead, the 10 gauge is not going to die. I hope you guys enjoyed this rambling, this dissertation to you. If you have any questions, be sure to leave them in the comments, or you can email me at americanarmschannel@gmail.com. As always, guys, God bless. Keep your powder dry. I'll see you in the next video.